Okay, we should get started. I'm Jim Grossman, Executive Director of the American Historical Association, the largest professional organization of historians in the world. We work on behalf of historians in all fields and in all sorts of workplaces and professions. The AHA promotes history education, the professional work of historians, and the essential role of historical thinking in public life. If you find this conversation interesting and useful, I hope you will consider joining. There will be a link in the chat, if it's not already there. There will be a link in the chat both at the beginning and at the end for our membership. Today's event is part of the AHA's History Behind the Headlines series, which features historians providing historical context for current events, suggesting how historical thinking offers different angles on the world around us. The History Behind the Headlines series is generously sponsored by AHA member Jared Brubaker. Today's discussion, which will run until 1 p.m. Eastern Time, brings together 4 distinguished historians to help us better understand the relationships between the Bible, the field of early American history, and public education. Our moderator will be John Butler, Howard R. Lamar Professor Emeritus of American Studies, History, and Religious Studies at Yale University, and former Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, former Chair of the Department of History, and former Chair of the American Studies Program. Lots of formers, John. His books include Awash in a Sea of Faith, Christianizing the American People, which won the AHA's Beveridge Award for Best Book in American History. Also, Becoming America, The Revolution Before 1776, Religion in American Life, A Short History, and God in Gotham, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan. And I'm going to hand things over to John, who will introduce his colleagues on our panel, and then I'm going to disappear until the end, and along with all of you, listen to this conversation. John, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jim. So I'm pleased to welcome everybody to the seminar, and the first thing I'm going to do is very briefly introduce my panelists so we can just get on to our discussion. And the first person I'm going to introduce is Holly Brewer, who's the Burke Professor of History at the University of Maryland. And she's the author of By Birth or Consent, Children, Law, and the Anglo-American Revolution and Authority. And she is currently finishing a book on slavery and sovereignty in early America and the British Empire. Heath Carter is Associate Professor of American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he's the author of Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago, and he's currently working on a book on the social gospel in American life. It's called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, Social Christians and the Fight to End American Inequality. And our third panelist is John Fia, who is Distinguished Professor of American History, or History, at Messiah University. And he's the author of, most recently, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, The Bible Cause, A History of the American Bible Society, and especially relevant to today's discussion is, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, a Historical Introduction? And so we're going to get started, and I'm going to start by just laying out the basics. We're here in part generated by an initiative announced by Ryan Walters, who is the State Superintendent of Public Instruction in the state of Oklahoma, who in June 27th of 2024, just a few weeks ago, about a month ago, issued an order, so to speak, saying effective immediately, all Oklahoma schools, I'm reading from the document he issued, all effective immediately, all Oklahoma schools are required to incorporate the Bible which includes the 10 Commandments as an instructional support into the curriculum across specific grade levels, that is, grades 5 through 12. He's ordered this to be had in all public schools. A few days ago, he issued a set of guidelines. They're a little hard to obtain. As of yesterday, they hadn't yet appeared on the Oklahoma Department of Education website, but he issued this in a Twitter feed or X feed, and the documents were definitely it was rather difficult to get them, but Holly very deftly managed to take a picture of each one. And now here we are, here are the documents right here. And we'll start with this because on the one hand, these are a set of support guidelines for teachers, all right? So they're issued for all the teachers in the state of Oklahoma who are going to incorporate the Bible at some point into their curriculum every year. And on the surface, they kind of appear rather innocuous. That is, they're going to discuss the historical context of the Bible's influence on Western civilization. Teachers are going to discuss the impact of the Bible on American history. Toward the end of the document, we're assured that there won't be any indoctrination, no proselytizing, no conversion effort, no anything of that kind. At different points, the guidelines innocuously say that teachers can incorporate views of other religions and whatnot. But maybe sort of the more astonishing part comes actually in the second paragraph, which provides that the memorandum and the included standards, this memorandum and included standards must be provided to every teacher, as well as providing a physical copy of the Bible, the United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the 10 Commandments as resources in every classroom in the school district. So this is from a historian's point of view, the whole issue of Bibles in the public school have long been a fraught matter across American history. So the city of Cincinnati fought the so-called Bible Wars. And when they said war, they weren't kidding. Okay, so there was a violence associated with the whole effort to introduce Bibles into the public school curriculum and into the hands of students. The memorandum doesn't specify that every student is to be provided with a Bible, but it does state that every classroom will be provided with the Christian Bible. So let's open the discussion, and I'll ask any of my panelists to join in and say, what do we think is happening here, and why is it the American Historical Association has issued a statement expressing real concern and opposition to this effort in Oklahoma? That it appears as though are we indoctrinating implicitly when we introduce the Bible into every classroom in the state of Oklahoma, but not other religious texts? Where are we going with this? And I may say that the AHA's statement has been endorsed by 16 scholarly organizations, including the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature, which is an enormous organization of the world's authorities on the Bible itself as a document. So let me ask my panelists to get started here. What do we think is happening, and what is interesting about this, and what is potentially problematic about it? John, why don't you start?
Sure. Happy to start with this. It's important to realize that the Bible can be taught in public schools. Abington v. Shemp, the 1963 case that removed devotional reading of the Bible from public schools, did allow the Bible to continue to be taught in public schools, but only as a kind of historical or literary document. The SMU Southern Methodist professor Mark Chancey has done a lot of really good work on this. I'd point you to his work on this issue. But there seems to be, so it seems to be the document that you read, John, by Walters, seems to be kind of taking advantage of that opportunity to keep the Bible in public schools. I think it's hard to think about that document, both the documents that you read, without thinking about the culture in which we are, the current moment that we are in. This is clearly a case based upon the kind of advisors that Walters has brought into this Bible project. He also has a project on American exceptionalism being taught in schools as well. I mean, these are people like Dennis Prager, David Barton. Those are the kind of people who are advising Walters on this question. And both of those men are very interested in kind of restoring America, quote unquote, to its Judeo-Christian roots. There's only one PhD on this, what Walters calls this A-list of advisors, and that's Kevin Roberts from the Heritage Foundation. He directs the Heritage Foundation and has a PhD in history from the University of Texas. But others on there are Steve Deese, an Iowa right-wing radio host, Mark Bauerlein, an English professor who writes for First Things. So with the exception of Roberts, there are no historians who are advising Walters. So for me, I want to think about how to reconcile his claims that there will be no proselytizing, this is not a political agenda, so forth, with the kind of people he's surrounding him with as advisors here, who are clearly in what might be called the kind of MAGA evangelical camp. So I find that some explaining needs to be done in terms of that. So that was my first reaction when I saw it.
So could I chime in there and say, in particular, what's a little bit scary about Kevin Roberts is, of course, he's the author of the Project 2025, which has an explicitly political agenda. And one of the things that's so interesting about this is there is clearly some attempt in the guidelines that were issued yesterday or Wednesday, I guess it was, by Walters to conform to Oklahoma law as well as the U.S. Constitution by saying that there should be no proselytizing going on in terms of biblical interpretation or particular religious sects. In fact, the questions that are framed in his guidelines are incredibly leading. So, for example, in terms of the historical context question, the question that teachers are required to ask, that in his mandated instructions are, teachers must focus on how biblical principles have shaped the foundational aspects of Western societies, such as the concepts of justice, human rights, and the rule of law. Instead of, it should be, I mean, a real question would be something much more like that's open-ended of teachers must focus on how biblical principles, what he says is teachers must focus on how biblical principles have shaped the foundational aspects of human societies. Should say something like teachers should explore the many intellectual influences that have shaped the concepts of justice, human rights, and the rule of law. So in other words, a lot of the questions here are really leading and focusing on a particular kind of interpretation that is to find the Bible as the only answer. And what's scary when you realize that one of the main people advising on this is also somebody who has particular political principles, is that if we're going to look at what the founders thought in terms of church and state issues, one of their main concerns was not having religion shape who has power. And this has the potential. I mean, you've got somebody who's writing Project 2025 as a main advisor on this. You're talking about, in fact, inserting politics into the classrooms in really explicit ways through religion.
I think one of the things that's most striking to me here is the kind of selectivity of the state superintendent's interest in reintroducing the Bible as a significant text into public schools. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the Bible has been an important text in American history and American life. It's played important roles in faith communities and in our public life as well. Sometimes for worse. And I think, if you think about the history of slavery and the ways that pro-slavery or apparently pro-slavery passages of scripture have been used throughout early American history and all the way up through the period of the Civil War to justify slavery. In fact, I mean, Mark Knoll's The Civil War is a Theological Crisis underscores that not just in the South, but across the North, folks found in the Bible evidence that the Bible was on the side of the slaveholder. And so that kind of critical analysis is actually a part of the work that historians do. One could imagine it being an interesting thing to introduce to Oklahoma school children, the ways that the Bible in a particular historical moment was used to justify chattel slavery. But I don't see that showing up in the state guidelines, which makes one wonder whether in fact the kind of state superintendent may be more interested in driving contemporary agendas, as my colleagues have just suggested, rather than in a kind of honest reckoning with the role of the Bible in the nation's past.
I would just add one more thing. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
No, I would just add one more thing to that. On July 15th, Steve Deese, David Barton, and Walters published an op-ed in the Washington Times in which they tried to encourage evangelicals to vote for Donald Trump because of what they call this cultural and spiritual war that's going on in classrooms about what's being taught to kids. So, we can't separate this from the political dimensions going on here. I would just say one more thing, which I think is undergirding this. When I wrote my book about the American Bible Society, one of the central themes of the American Bible Society was if you just distribute the Bible without quote unquote note or comment, was the phrase that they used, somehow there would be a process, and they thought it was the Holy Spirit or God. If you just handed someone a Bible, they would read it and the Spirit would illuminate that Bible to lead them to conversion, but also to a more Christian kind of nation. So I think you see this with, if you just put the Bible in the classroom, if you just have the 10 Commandments in the Louisiana case in the classroom, you don't even have to kind of proselytize, I think they might argue, because there will be a spiritual dimension to this in which by some kind of, godly power, the Bible will do its work, is what the American Bible Society used to say. So I'm wondering how much of this is going on too. This idea of the Bible doing its work has been around since 1815 when the American Bible Society was founded.
And yet there's a real worry here, because if some of the questions that are being asked, which direct students to evaluate the Bible to come to answers, are actually putting teachers in the position of having to evaluate doctrine. So there's a lot of really kind of creepy elements of this that put it sort of over the edge of what the law might be. And the other part that's really kind of interesting in terms of what John was saying is that it says that the Bible has to be in every classroom. And that includes math classes and science classes, and that all teachers, including math and science teachers, are supposed to be teaching the Bible. And coming up with in creative ways of doing so. And that is just, it's kind of, and this is mandated. He says it's not, they could lose their licenses. This is really overstepping a lot of bounds.
It's the Bible doing its work, as they would say, right? You just put it there. And you have to trust teachers on this too. I mean, in one sense, teachers are mandated to do this. I spend a lot of time with American history teachers. They also, are not just passive entities in the classroom. I mean, they know, when they're preaching and when they're using the Bible as literature. And, in some ways you need to kind of trust their training, which, is a whole other question and issue.
And can I just pick up on one of Heath's comments from earlier too about slavery? And not only was slavery justified using the Bible, but so too was the divine right of kings. And we're seeing a lot of that imagery coming up in this election too. The Republican convention, over and over again, Donald Trump himself was saying, I was saved by God. All these people were using bandages on their ears as though all the many participants were wearing bandages on their right ears, as I guess it's this one, as though they too were suffering the wounds of Christ. I mean, there's all kinds of religious imagery going on in the Republican right now. And so thinking about what it means to put the Bible in the classroom and to emphasize to students that this is how they have to interpret everything pretty much has very explicit political ramifications today.
It's important also to know that the Bible wasn't used just only to justify slavery, it was also used to justify Jim Crow. And in the 1950s, after the Supreme Court decision desegregating the public schools, Jerry Falwell printed a sermon in his own local church newsletter in which he quoted the story of Ham, used to justify slavery, to argue that, in fact, the Supreme Court had violated biblical injunctions on the races. And here we are. So it isn't just a, quote, historical problem. It becomes a contemporary problem. And what has underlined so much racial tension in the United States has been the issue of these biblical verses that are used to justify views that blacks are inferior, they should be separated, etc., that still hang around in our culture today. And that's what I think is interesting about, I think Heath is quite right, interesting about these guidelines is that some difficult questions, many difficult questions about what the Bible allegedly teaches, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't, what the Bible allegedly teaches is not handled here. This is a kind of, well, what about what hymns, what music was influenced by the Bible? What great composers were influenced by the Bible? What literature is influenced by the Bible? Well, on the literature question, there are many kinds of literature, and not all of it is the kind of literature influenced by the Bible that Mr. Walters would like. I'm not sure that that William Faulkner, for example, is exactly the kind of author that he would be wanting to say something about the Bible and Southern culture, for example. So it's a problematic issue.
Yeah, the question is, John, then are teachers, are these generic enough so that a teacher who wants to do exactly what you just did in the classroom can do it? I'm not sure about this.
There is a way, yeah, I think it's reading deeply against the grain of the guidelines, but to say, well, the Bible's contribution to Western civilization may include some great works of literature, but it also includes racism, colonialism, imperialism, capital, and a real, true, historically serious investigation of the Bible's role in the past is going to have to involve all of that. So that's
Are you suggesting, Heath, that there's a potential that this could backfire? Or
I mean, I think it's unlikely to backfire. I think that that's reading against the grain clearly of the guidelines, but someone who really wanted to take the idea seriously. I mean, inside, I mean, I think in some sense, I mean, historians have taken, again, very seriously the Christian dimensions of the American past, the role of the Bible. It's not as though this has been ignored by the historical profession. It's just that it's been done in a deeply contextualized, rigorous, comprehensive way that in some sense leaves one with a sense of the very complex roles that Christianity, the Bible, etc., have played in the best and the very worst parts of our
Yeah.
nation's history.
Well,
Right. So the guidelines, I mean, one good thing about the guidelines, I suppose, is they emphasize some of the ways in which the Bible has contributed to ideas about human rights. So something like Martin Luther King's speech, for example. But when you don't have that complexity and you say the Bible has to teach I mean, it has to inform and it's the basis of answering every question, which is what seems to almost come out of these guidelines, you pull out all the other intellectual forces that have helped to shape America's foundational principles of justice, for example, such as related to the Enlightenment or political theory or questions. And so it ends up reducing the conversation that can be had in those classrooms.
Well, just to pick up on the point that John made, our teachers, elementary teachers, high school teachers, middle school teachers, are sophisticated people.
Right.
And so the question here is, let's imagine that a serious high school teacher teaching juniors or seniors or sophomores or whatnot decides to investigate the relationship of the Bible to slavery or the relationship of the Bible to Jim Crow. My guess is that that's going to generate some pushback from some parents. That I'm not justifying that. I'm saying it's very likely to generate some pushback for some parents who will they get in touch with Mr. Walters? Some of his statements are very threatening to teachers about losing their licenses and
Yeah.
they're going to be forced to do this and that.
Yeah.
So we're entering a difficult stage here that has, I think, all to do with contemporary politics and a lot less to do with the teaching of history.
Well, I think it has a lot to do too with the way in which, to add to that, John, the way in which people think about the relationship between the past and the present today. It's tied into, you see this in constitutional, analysis with originalism, right? That somehow the 1787 was sort of frozen in time, and now we transport it as if no change over time, right? Which historians think about, happened between now and 2024. So I think there's a really irresponsible way here in terms of the historical thinking skills where historians can step in and say, that's not how to engage with the past. But you have this way of engaging with the past as if you cherry pick what you need. And I think there's certain parts of the left that do this as well. You cherry pick what you need, and then you advance public policy based upon that cherry picked history, which, as Heath was saying, is not complex, is not nuanced. I think that's part of the problem. If David Barton came up to me with the quote about John Adams saying, or the farewell address of Washington, and said, religion is a pillar of society, right? And held it up. He probably has a copy of it somewhere in his house in Aledo, Texas. And I would say, deal with that, Thea. I would say, you're right. He said that, right? So it's not an issue of kind of finding the facts. It's an issue of how those facts then impact the way we think about the present. And I think that's a big challenge as well, in addition to just getting the facts right.
Right. And so one of the things that he influences, that Ryan Walters influences in his guidelines is the role and what he's talked about on television, et cetera, is you have to acknowledge that the word creator is in the Declaration of Independence. Well, sure, the word creator is in there,
And no
but
argument.
right, yeah, and there were religious arguments and Tom's Paine and Common Sense, which is a really important text in justifying the revolution, uses a lot of actually biblical citations, right? It's great and fine to talk about that, but to understand the Declaration of Independence requires more than just consulting the Bible. I mean, there are no citations in the margins to which chapters, and the ideas of that all men are created equal, or most of those ideas, were fiercely argued about in the 18th century. And you can't just study the Declaration of Independence and the Bible together as though you're going to get some sort of doctrine without, and that it's just based on the Bible. And I was thinking that everything that's said there is simply based on the Bible. I was thinking about Walter's own background, educational background. And it's fascinating to me that he was a history teacher for 8 years in high schools. And he probably was a history major as an undergraduate, but he went to a religious private college. And it's pretty clear that, in fact, a lot of what he learned at that college, which is Bible and scripture based, is that American history connects into different ways to the Bible. So maybe he just wants to import that into Oklahoma's classrooms.
Yeah, I would, someone who also teaches at a Christian college, I'm not entirely sure that that most Christian colleges are imbibing. Harding University, where he went, is a Churches of Christ school, very conservative Churches of Christ school, but I don't know of any historian on that faculty, and I know that faculty that would advance that. But there are people at Bob Jones University and Liberty University who reject David Barton and this whole Christian nationalist idea. I think we're talking more here about the power of these non-academic historians like Barton, or I don't even call Barton a historian. He's a political propagandist who uses the past to advance his agenda. But it's these people and the power that these people have that the academic historians in their ivory towers are off. It's very difficult for us to match them when they are so well funded by conservative organizations. They're out there, preaching this quote unquote gospel. But it could be maybe there was something at Harding University. I'm not doubting that, Holly, but I think
I was just speculating.
Yeah.
The didacticism with which he's approaching this seems to come from somewhere.
I mean, I think the other thing that strikes me is, Walter's working in this kind of vein of American exceptionalism that also has a long history in the United States. And just like the Bible and Christianity, which have had robust influence on the American past, this kind of idea of the nation as chosen by God, that has a long history. And historians study that history, and they also look at countervailing perspectives that, one of our colleagues recently passed, Albert Rabbitoe, loved to say that, if for white Christians, the United States was a new Israel, for many Black folks, it was a new Egypt. And there's a kind of long history of debate and interpretation around the meaning of the nation's past. That debate, remains robust today with the 1619 Project and folks who want to really hold on to the idea, Jill Lepore's These Truths, right? That there is a really important, robust room for debate about what the meaning of the nation's past is. The question that I have for this project in Oklahoma is sort of what is the work that this particular way of engaging the nation's past is doing in our present? This is one of the kinds of questions that historians ask when they look at exceptionalist renditions of history throughout the nation's past. What work is it doing in that moment? And I think this project is doing work in a context of a pluralist nation. It's been pluralist for a long time, as John Butler's work has underscored. What does it mean to lift out this particular current in the way that they are? That to me is a really important sort of question, worthy of historical investigation. What work is this doing in the state of Oklahoma and beyond?
Well, one issue that seems to me implicit in the guidelines is the assumption that they're not, by concentrating so much on the Bible, that there are also the believers, and that the believers were sort of as uniform as the Bible. The catch is, of course, is that colonial America was famously, in some cases infamously, pluralistic in a way that it was unprecedented in Western civilization. That is, there was no area, no set of colonies, no new nation that had as many different kinds of religious groups, most of them attached to Christianity, but so many different kinds of religious groups, most of which would read the Bible quite differently. Certainly, they would read certain sections of the Bible quite differently. Think of the views, the difference between Quakers on the question of women and most other denominations on the question of women. They were quite different. So the question is, when you say the influence of the Bible on, say, the revolutionary generation or the constitutional generation or the Constitution, whose understanding of the Bible are we talking about? And that's where historians bring something to bear that pundits don't. That is, with all due respect to pundits, and many of them are very smart, but really they have a very superficial understanding. And that's where teachers can bring something to the subject in their classrooms, including high school, middle school classrooms. But it's not clear to me that that's what the guidelines would really permit or would encourage. So I think we need to think about the really turmoil of religion, religious views and beliefs and whatnot in the constitutional period, and which also makes, if I may say, the Constitution itself, purely as a document, unique in that the only reference to religion in the Constitution is Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office.
Well, and Article 1, no established. And so, but let me just add that very, the ways in which so many religious groups flourished in some colonies more than others, but also the extent to which there was an established religion, the Anglican Church in most colonies that upheld the authority of the king, meant that religion was really, that the founders understood things about the possible misuse of religion that I think in some ways we've kind of forgotten. So in Virginia, which is where the First Amendment comes from, what Jefferson emphasized in terms of separation of church and state, it's all the meetings of the House of Burgesses began with the prayer for the health of the king and an acknowledgement of their obedience to him. This is the elected body in colonial Virginia, and you had to pay a fine if you didn't attend the Anglican Church regularly. And if you were a Baptist preacher, for example, bad things could happen to you, and you could be arrested and fined and publicly whipped by the sheriff, as Reese Isaac pointed out in one famous example in 1771. And so it's no coincidence that in 1802, when Jefferson wrote his famous letter about the First Amendment creating a wall between church and state in the terms of no establishment, he was writing to the Danbury Baptists. So he was writing to people who remembered having faced that kind of prosecution. And so they were super aware of how religious dogma could be used to set up and to hold people in power. And that's why they were so explicitly concerned about the establishment of religion. And I will just say there are elements of Walter's proposals that definitely look a little bit like establishment of a religion.
I think the big question is, just from making a historical point here, whether or not, America was Virginia writ large. There obviously was a lot of religious freedom. Defer to my middle colonies expert over here, John Butler. And these kinds. So it is very complex. But your larger point, I think, is pretty well taken. Can I take a quick shot, John, at what the religious roots are of this whole manga movie? I mean, I think you're really seeing whether or not they identify with kind of reformed kind of Christianity, that kind of Puritan Calvinism. I think that's where this is coming from, right? This idea that all of culture can be taken captive for Christ. The Dutch Calvinists in Western Michigan like to talk about Abraham Kuyper taking every square inch of the culture, and they do it, I think, in a really responsible way, thinking about questions of justice and the poor and those kinds of things. But that can easily be kind of morphed into what we often refer to now as some of these. There's a lot of good people studying this now. This kind of seven mountain dominionism, where the purpose is to capture these various segments of culture, whether it be education, politics, Hollywood, and so forth. And some even argue that would precipitate the return of Christ once Christians capture these things. It is an extreme version of this kind of Calvinist, we must embrace every aspect of the culture. Again, I'm not casting aspersions on all Calvinists here, because a lot of them do this very responsibly in terms of this vision. But it's certainly not kind of a Lutheran two kingdoms kind of thing or something to that effect. So I think whether or not Walters even understands this, I think this kind of historical trajectory is driving a lot of this reclaim America for Christ kind of language. And let's start with the schools.
It's also, there's a lot of Catholic influence.
A certain kind of Catholicism.
And in fact, he seems to be working pretty closely with the Catholic Church in Oklahoma City, supporting a charter school that would teach religion, run by the Catholic Diocese of Oklahoma City. And I just want to step back for just a minute and point out something I realized with respect to the latest court case by the Supreme Court, which of course is actually dominated by Catholics, and in terms of the majority opinion. And there is no space in that 90-page, in the part that's written by the majority, that reflects on the question of balance of power. And so I had this,
the immunity case.
The immunity case, Trump versus United States. And so I said to one of my children, who's just graduated from public high school here in Maryland, and I said, did you study balance of power in your government class in 10th grade? And he said immediately, oh yeah, Mom, that's one of the first things we learned. It was super important. And I started looking, two of our Supreme Court justices went to a Catholic high school, Georgetown Prep, here in Washington, D.C., and I looked up their curriculum. Did they never study this? Because it doesn't seem to be important to them at all. And it turns out, no, they had no government class. They had no civics class. They had classes on theology and on Latin all 4 years in the curriculum there. But there's a little bit of history, but there is no civics and there's no government. So in fact, education is really important. And if we turn our education into something that emphasizes just religion and that doesn't emphasize civics or in some of the classical ways, we are shaping what the future will choose to do and what they'll think is important, I think, in more profound ways than are completely evident at first glance.
How do we think that this intersects with what's happened in Louisiana with the posting of the 10 Commandments in all Louisiana public schools? Is this what Walters has done is it just follows shortly on the Louisiana effort. And I guess the question to me is, again, what's the purpose what is going on here? What is the purpose of putting that up on the wall?
I mean, one thing that's striking to me, and Louisiana is interesting because of the large Catholic presence there, and Holly, I appreciate your reference to kind of Catholic involvement in Oklahoma as well. I mean, one thing that's really striking in terms of the history of American public schools is, I mean, Catholics built a separate school system in part because it is in fact the case that in the 19th century, public schools were perceived to have a kind of unconsciously Protestant sort of ethos. So it's fascinating the convergence, and this is a part of a larger story of kind of convergences of evangelical and Catholic conservatives in the late 20th century United States. These are long folks that would have been at odds in the American past. But I mean, I think part of what's going on is, I mean, schools have always also been places of civic formation, a kind of moral formation. And there is I think an effort on the part of these folks across state lines to take the schools back for a certain kind of vision of what good moral formation might be. The challenge again, and for those of us who are American historians, is a sort of deeper engagement in the history of that tradition would lead us also to interrogate its many, many problematic connections to some of the worst aspects of our nation's history. And it's the kind of recovery of that project without the critical engagement with its real deep problems in our past that is really alarming to me.
I think I know, actually, I don't know if they showed up or not, but I know there's a lot of teachers, K through 12 teachers listening today. At least that's what they've told me. And this gets to John's question about what is it doing, right? Whenever you have a document, in this case, the 10 Commandments, right? You're always asking, what is the document saying, right? Obviously, it says, thou shalt not, blah, blah, blah. But I think an extra part of the historical thinking process has to be, what is that document then doing when it's presented? I mean, this is a fundamental. Sam Weinberg talks about this in historical thinking and other unnatural acts, right? What is the document doing? And I think that's a fair historical question. At 100 years from now, right? Someone investigating this case, a historian is going to say, yeah, they posted the 10 Commandments. Here's what the 10 Commandments said, assuming, we forgot what they said or whatever. But here's what this is actually doing. And I think that's a question for us now, but it's also going to be the question that future historians are going to have to unpack.
So where are teachers left? The interesting thing about the guidelines, of course, is that the guidelines don't provide teachers with a single set of classroom plans.
Yeah.
There's no the guidelines don't provide any materials. The guidelines don't, there's nothing here. So what is the civics teacher for 10th grade going to do? Where is that teacher going to get those materials?
In some ways, that could be a good thing.
Yes, it could be.
Because it doesn't force, like before, it doesn't force them to sort of take, but it also, the lack of sort of resources with this, and again, maybe this quote unquote A-list team is coming up with the resources, but it also suggests that this may just be some kind of a political statement, right? We don't really care about how this is taught. We just want to flash this out there and say, look what we're doing in Oklahoma. We're fighting the good fight, this kind of thing. And I think I don't think I could prove that, but it's certainly something to consider.
It reminds me, John, of when, Trump held the Bible upside down outside.
Yeah.
It's a kind of cultural symbol.
Yeah.
More so than any particular interest in actual substantive engagement with.
And the good teachers out there
right
are going to know better. They're going to see through this.
Absolutely.
And the question is, though, John, what will the consequences be for seeing through it? I think that's yet to be seen.
And I think part of the problem too is the teachers who are not as dedicated, who, maybe their main goal is to be the baseball coach or whatever, and then they have to comply with this. And then they do it in some really simplistic ways. And so that one of the things that Oklahoma students will get in grades 5 through 12, in supposedly every classroom, even I guess math and science, is that turning to the Bible to come to for answers is what they should be doing on a normal basis, and as opposed to say other kinds of texts or sources. And that's a little bit frightening.
Yeah, I'm sure there are those sort of political activists as teacher kind of out there, right?
And that's going
Those
to happen
activists
too.
are not just on the left, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I
And
think
it gets to the larger question of, how much activism should be played in a history class.
Well, and also if somebody isn't the right faith and their teachers and activists, whether, and it's not even just whether they're Jewish or Sikh or whatever, but whether they're the right kind of Protestant faith, right? They could end up, students could end up getting low grades or failing or being made really unhappy because they aren't expressing the right opinions. And that is scary.
Well, that also, we asked, what's going to be the student reaction? Most American classrooms are filled with students from all kinds of backgrounds, especially less so or rural areas where I grew up, for example, but in all urban areas, the variety of religious beliefs among students is overwhelming. And so what is going to be the reaction of a Muslim student, a Somali student, a Hindu student, all the students from families for whom religion isn't important? How are they going to react to this kind of teaching?
I could imagine, I mean, a teacher who wanted to do a credible job in teaching American history and the role of religion in the past could probably fulfill these guidelines. Again, reading against the grain. I mean, I don't know if the AHA could come up with a bibliography of books that talk about the ways that the Bible has been used by all kinds of parties in the American past and read in so many different kinds of ways. And you could have a really interesting lesson. I mean, John Butler, like you're suggesting on where we'd assign a Martin Luther King speech and look for the biblical citations there, and assign a speech given by a segregationist minister in that same era, and compare the ways that the Bible is brought to bear. You could do that throughout the American past. You could imagine, I mean, it'd be a lot of work for a history teacher in a public school to do. But there would be and you could imagine really interesting college courses being taken by students of many different religious backgrounds that would explore the rich, complicated, contested history of the Bible in American life, and it would be really illuminating. Don't think that's what these guidelines are intended to produce, but one could imagine someone still pulling it off if they have the time and dedication to give it a go.
Well, I think we're coming up to the end of our seminar. And so I'll invite, here is Jim Grossman right here to tell us goodbye.
Oh, you're muted, Jim.
You would think that by now one would remember such things. The first thing I want to do is to respond to Heath's suggestion. The American Historical Association can come up with a bibliography on any historical issue. We usually start by finding the right historian to help us do it. And I very much appreciate Heath's willingness to volunteer to get us started. This is a standard AHA approach to life, which is when you suggest something, we consider you a volunteer. So this does conclude our panel, our History Behind the Headlines panel on the role of the Bible in the founding of the United States and religious mandates in public schools. We hope you found this conversation helpful, productive. Please watch our calendar. We're working on the possibility of a session in the next month or so on controversial issues relating to history education. Everybody who registered for today's webinar will receive a follow-up email with a link to a recording as soon as we have it and can share it. If you're already a member of the AHA, thank you for your support. If you're not a member, we hope that you will join today. We will post I think we have already. We've posted a link in the chat that you can go to join easily. Also, these are the kinds of issues, whether it's religion or other historical aspects of contemporary American culture, contemporary world culture and issues. We do this at our annual meeting every year. And this year it's in New York, January 3 through 6. Again, you can find on our website very easily the information. If you are a New York public school teacher, you do not have to pay a registration fee. All New York public school teachers are our guests at our annual meeting in New York. Finally, I want to thank our moderator, our panelists for giving so generously of their time today. Not just today, because I am well aware that all four of our guests prepared for this conversation. And we also want to thank our 350 attendees for spending this hour with us. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us. We do respond. Those of you who are members can continue this conversation in our member forum. Those of you who are not members and want to continue this conversation, you can join and participate in this conversation in our member forum. And we're done. Thank you all very much.